Good evening, and welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Victoria. My name is James Carey. I'm a council member here. And we want to welcome you tonight for an event co-hosted with the Middle Eastern Studies Forum, the MESF, at Deakin University. Tonight, we are joined by Professor Shahram Akhbarzadeh as we try and understand one of the premier events currently occurring in international affairs. Following the death of the young Kurdish woman Mahsa Amini, Iran has been experiencing a state of what can only be described as unbelievable turmoil. As the world watches on in disbelief, the Iranian government seems to have turned their weapons on their own citizens. Reports of deaths of over 200 have been widely reported at the hands of the security agencies. Public protests and strikes have now gone beyond just calling for justice for Ms. Amini, and instead have focused now on the legitimacy of the rule of what has been described as the quote-unquote dictatorship. The Islamic Republic of Iran is facing a threat to its very existence from within, which makes it extremely hard to counter. In the absence of an organized opposition leadership, it's not clear what could replace, or even if that's preferable, the current model of government. At the same time, though, pressure from below has opened up fissures at the top. While the top echelon is keen to preserve the image of unity, cracks have appeared within Islamic seminaries, the very ideological base of the regime. What does the future hold? Joining us to discuss this is the convener of the MESF and research professor in Middle East and Central Asian politics at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization at the Deakin University. He has held the prestigious ARC Future Fellowship on the role of Islam in Iran's foreign policy making, and recently completed a Qatar Foundation grant on sectarianism in the Middle East. Professor Akhbarzadeh has an extensive publication record and has contributed to public debate on topics such as democracy and political processes of the Middle East, regional rivalry, and Islamic militancy. The second edition of his book, Middle East Politics and International Relations, Crisis Zone, published by Routledge this year, is now available. We welcome you this evening, and we hope you can make sense of what's going on right now.
Thank you so much for your generous introduction, James. It's a pleasure to be with you. Let me see if I can share my screen and
absolutely,
and take it from there. Well, I think you could actually do the presentation for me. All the big points that I was going to make, you've touched on. So well done to you for really capturing the crisis and what's going on in the country. If I may just flesh out some of those points. What happened? Oh, I'm not doing the slideshow. Beg your pardon, let me start again. Okay, so what really happened about 5 weeks ago was that a woman named Mahsa Amini was arrested and detained on charges of not wearing her hijab properly. I'll come back to why this has become more of an issue in the past year or so. But in the course of her detention, she was allegedly beaten and she collapsed in detention and passed away. The regime denied any wrongdoing. Islamic Republic of Iran denied beating her. They denied using force to detain her. But indications are quite clear. There is damage to her brain. There's a skull fracture, and even though the regime tried to say she had pre-existing health conditions, it was very clear to all observers that she was really beaten on the head. Now, this led to a range of women protests in Tehran, but also in Kurdistan, where she came from. Mahsa was of Kurdish background, was in fact visiting Tehran as a tourist. visiting friends. So obviously, in her hometown, there were mass protests. And the mass protests, it was not just about her death and the manner of her death. It grew very quickly into a mass protest regarding the state's misogyny towards women and all the state policies and regulations and limitations placed on women. For example, women cannot travel internationally without a written consent from a male guardian. If the woman is married, it has to be her husband. If she's unmarried, it has to be her father. Another example, women cannot run for presidency in Iran. It's against the law. So what was really, what initially started as a protest against the brutal killing of Mahsa Amini quickly grew into a national movement against how the regime treats women and how the regime treats the population as a whole. That's why the chant "Women, Life, Freedom" was so popular. It really caught the imagination of Iranians across the country because it really captured all the big points that people in Iran have been really grieving about, complaining about, trying to challenge. And it really turned into an anti-system protest. And that is why we're here now. That's why 5 weeks since the death of Mahsa Amini, there are still protests in the streets. There are still students on strike at universities and at schools across the country, not just Tehran, but in many other cities. So there was no surprise, and this is a very important point to bear in mind. There was no surprise that this was happening. When President Ebrahim Raisi came to office, he was in fact quite clear about his intentions. He has a conservative background. He has been talking about rolling back some of the freedom and liberties that people have enjoyed under the presidency of Rouhani. And I guess the writing was on the wall. What wasn't clear to what extent he would go. He came to office with a minority of the vote, even though he got 63% of the votes at the ballot box. More than half the population did not attend the ballot box. And this is a very big factor, very big issue for the Iranian regime. The regime has, especially the supreme leader, has been consistently saying that you need to attend the ballot box, participate in the election, even if you don't like it, come and have your say, because they identify popular participation at the ballot box as a show of legitimacy and a show of acceptance, consent for the regime as a whole, regardless of which faction that they might support. So the fact that more than half the population did not attend the ballot box, this was the first time at the presidential election, the participation rate fell below 50%. So that's quite telling, quite telling. But nonetheless, Raisi has come to office more than a year now, and he's been really pushing through his very conservative agenda. I have there a little note that Raisi's credentials should have really been a warning sign for many observers. In fact, Amnesty International has named him as one of the 4 people responsible for the mass killing of political prisoners in Iran in 1988, when he was deputy prosecutor in Tehran. And he has a history and background track record of working within the conservative hierarchy, serving as a chief justice and prosecutor general before coming president. So when he came president, one of his first acts was to say, let's roll back these civil liberties. He increased the budget for the morality police last year. And the morality police is the party, the body that has been engaged in enforcing compulsory hijab in public places. He also issued a decree, a statement that men and women at work should refrain from intermingling and talking to each other if it doesn't relate to work specifically. Right. Right. Now, as you might imagine, his policies were not very popular. Iranian population is very young. About 37% or so of the population was born after the revolution, but they're very much connected globally. They're young, they have aspirations, as all young people do globally. They have, beg pardon, they have hopes and aspirations. They have access to mobile phones, which means they can connect with their friends, family, relatives overseas. They can have access to international produced media, and they see the difference between their lifestyle, the limitations on their life, and what's going on outside, even in the region, in United Arab Emirates, even in the region, in Iraq, even in the neighborhood. So they see the difference and they see the limitations and they want more. They obviously see that they are being suppressed. And also add to that, the Iranian population as a whole is very much connected internationally. They have access to the internet, 84%, which is one of the highest internet connectivity rates you might get in the Middle East. So there's a mismatch here between what the population wants and what the government of Ebrahim Raisi is trying to enforce. And that tension, that gap between the two has really blown up in the streets. And the killing of Mahsa Amini was the straw that broke the camel's back. So the government has responded in its traditional way. What they do when there is protest, they shut down the internet. And that is supposed to really disconnect the protesters from their supporters, from the international community, from the international media, and to contain the news. Also, to contain protests within localities. So if there's no internet, if there's no WhatsApp is kind of blocked. Instagram is blocked. So if apps are blocked, then it's difficult for the protesters to coordinate and turn this revolution, or cultural revolution, turn this into something bigger. So it is a measure that the regime has adopted, and it's quite common for them to do that. To some degree, it's been successful, but it has not stopped the outpouring of dissent and desire for change. Now, there's a lot of discussion going on whether or not this is a revolution. Whether we should see it as a revolution, what's to come. I think it is an attempt as a revolution, that is, it's trying to do something significantly different, change the system. I see this as an anti-systemic revolt. And if you compare that to other examples, for example, in 2009, we had the Green Movement. And at that time, of course, it was publicized and reported on very widely. People were in the streets. demanding a recount of the presidential election vote. They were saying that Ahmadinejad had stolen the election and that their candidates, Mir Hossein Mousavi, who was one of the candidates, has lost the vote because of widespread fraud. That's debatable now. In hindsight, that's debatable. But at the time, there was genuine belief among the reformist camp that the votes were stolen and this was a fraudulent election. The Green movement had a very significant presence in the middle class in major capital cities. Again, you see women as being at the forefront of that movement, which is quite significant, especially because women have been suppressed systematically by the Islamic regime. They often are at the forefront of revolt and rebellion against the regime because they have lost so much. But one thing that really differentiates the Green movement and what happened after the Green movement, there have been many other upheavals, street riots across the country in different locations, often related to price hikes, whether to do with the price of chicken or price of oil. There have been protests of that nature, but all of these were sporadic. What's really different about what's happening right now is that it is a national movement. We see it happening across the country, not just major capital cities. We see it in a lot of provincial cities. We see it in small cities, townships. We see it in Kurdistan, in Sistan, and in Khuzestan. These are three ethnically populated regions of Iran that feel completely left out of the political system. They feel marginalized. So there is that sense that ethnic minorities also have a stake in a change to come for the better. So they are asking for some fundamental change. And that's really what makes the revolution now different to past experiences. Whereas past revolts, past riots have been subject-specific. They have been trying to modify aspects of the regime. What we see now quite widely across the country is demand for fundamental change in the regime. And when I say fundamental change, I'm referring to this system of government, the system of Vilayat Faqih. I'll let you have a look at that graph. Just briefly, I tried to make sense of how the various structures, various institutions within the structure work together and connect with each other. Just have a quick look. What's significant is that at the bottom of the screen, you see the president and you see the parliament, and these are elected bodies. And that gives a sense that Iran is a republic, that people's voices, people's votes matter, that they can actually change something. And that's an important aspect of the regime. The regime really needs and relies on generating that sense of, we buy into this idea of having an Islamic Republic because it is a republic. Our vote matters. But then if you look at how the president operates and how the parliament operates, that idea of people's voice kind of dwindles and it loses traction, loses prominence. Because I'm not sure if you see my cursor moving, but the parliament is overseen by the Guardian Council in the center. The Guardian Council is a body that decides which bill can pass, which bill is consistent with the ideals of the regime, and which bill can be vetoed. The Guardian Council also decides who can stand for election. So you always have a long list of candidates who nominate, long list of nominates for the parliament and also for presidency. But the Guardian Council pairs it back and decide who can actually stand as a candidate. So they have unlimited power effectively on which direction the parliament or the president could go. And the Guardian Council is appointed by the supreme leader at the very top. At the moment, we have Ali Khamenei as the supreme leader, Wali Faqih, and he decides. He appoints 6 members to the Guardian Council. He also appoints the head of the judiciary, and the judiciary nominates 6 others who go to parliament, and then parliament elects them to the Guardian Council. So this is a closed loop, effectively. It's a closed loop where the supreme leader at the top can decide who can serve the regime better and what level of dissent, what level of opposition can be tolerated in the parliament. So we did have a reformist parliament under Khatami, and that was quite significant. But the reformist parliament under Khatami was powerless because all the decrees, all the bills they wanted to pass were vetoed by the Guardian Council. So they might get elected to parliament, but they can't really enforce any change, enact any change. You might say it's farcical, but many of those reformist parliamentarians who had once cleared the vetting process by the Guardian Council were vetoed out second time they stood for election for not being compliant with the Islamic Republic. So it gets a bit farcical. It's very arbitrary. And I think arbitrary is the best definition of the way the regime operates. It's arbitrary, it's at the whim of the supreme leader and people he appoints to various parts of the system. So the popular movement for change is asking for fundamental change. They're asking for an end to dictatorship. If you watch the news, you know, the clips, they say down with dictator, and they're referring to the supreme leader, who they see as the ultimate dictator who governs everything in the regime. Now, they're asking for change, but can change happen? That's $1 million question. Will the regime buckle under pressure? Interestingly, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards hasn't actually been very active in suppressing the protesters. The suppression of protesters have been left to the police force, and the Revolutionary Guards have kind of stayed back. They've held back. The Revolutionary Guards have an ideological commitment to the survival of the regime. And they see what's happening in the streets as the tension between the United States and the West and the Islamic Republic playing out. It's being played out. And that is why, if you listen to all the statements made by the regime officials, they constantly blame the West for instigating discord, for misleading the youth, for spreading lies about how the regime operates. The attention and the blame has been consistently at the United States and at the Western media for instigating discord, as if the people in Iran, as if the people in the streets are complete mindless drones who follow instructions from Washington. So that's the way they see the world. They see the world divided between the United States and dominated by the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran presenting a challenge to it. So this is the latest episode of the same tension, latest iteration of the same conflict between Iran and the United States. But in addition to that ideological outlook, there's also tangible issues at play that ties Islamic revolutionary guards to the regime. And that is in the shape of many benefits they receive as being part of the regime. And the most significant one is the foundations that they control. So the Revolutionary Guards controls foundations, a set of subsidiaries. Two of those very rich subsidiary foundations are the Musas and the Shahid and Umur Janbazan, which stands for one. The first one is the foundation of the oppressed, and the second one is the foundation of martyrs and veterans. Both have a number of corporations, companies that they operate in manufacturing, in construction business. They win government grants and government contracts, and they even compete regionally. And recently, one of them, the General Mechanics Civil and Housing Organization, which is a subsidiary of the foundation, received a $30 million contract from UAE. So there is a lot of tangible factors that tie the Revolutionary Guards to the regime. And that is why I am very, very suspicious of people who say, of calls, who's about soldiers in the Revolutionary Guards putting their guns down and joining the protest because they are part of the nation, or expectations that the guard would somehow stop shooting and not engage in suppression of dissidents. That kind of mentality, that kind of thinking really relates to more conventional armed forces, perhaps in Egypt, where during the Arab Revolution, during the Arab Spring, the army decided that it was enough. It had enough of killing civilians in the streets, and they stepped back, and the revolution succeeded for a short time. That kind of dynamic is not going to work in Iran because the Revolutionary Guards have vested interest in the survival of the regime. But there are signs that might be seen as hopeful. You did mention cracks at the top, James. Thank you for mentioning that. Surprisingly, President Khatami, who has been the poster boy of reform and reformists in Iran, has been very quiet. He hasn't said anything about the protesters, about the brutal suppression and the beating of protesters in the streets, the violence meted out by security agencies on the protesters. He's been very quiet. He made one small reference. There was a terrorist attack in Shiraz. For that, he came out and made a public statement. And then he said he would call for peaceful resolution of tensions, which is a very vague statement, really not blaming anyone for anything. I don't know why he is so quiet, whether it's for self-preservation or other issues at play, but that's the case with Khatami. Mir Hossein Mousavi, that I mentioned earlier, who was a candidate in 2009, competing against Ahmadinejad. He has been under house arrest for more than 10 years now. He has been vocal from house arrest, making statements, and he has been saying that the Revolutionary Guards should join the people I think it is. I think it is not a realistic expectation, but anyway, he has been vocal in support of the protesters. What is most significant, in my view, most significant, is that there have been a number of seminary students in Mashhad, in Qom, and in Tehran who have made a public statement, issued a letter to say that the supreme leader doesn't really have the credentials to serve as an Islamic jurist, and therefore he cannot occupy the position of Wali Faqih, supreme leader. And that hijab for women is mandated by Islam from their view, but it is not the role of the state to enforce it. It is a voluntary obligation, not compulsory by the state. So that's a very, very radical interpretation of Islamic law, and radical interpretation of how the Iranian regime should operate, and really undercuts a lot of the claims made by the Iranian regime on why it is behaving the way it's behaving. So that's a very, very I don't want to say promising, but it's a very significant challenge to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, you will have heard news of Iranian diaspora also being very, very active and very vocal. There have been protests in the US. There was a major protest in Berlin. Thousands and thousands of Iranian diaspora participated. My reading of the Iranian diaspora movement is that it is, first of all, divided, and there are a number of organized parties within the diaspora who are trying to claim the revolution as their own. So I'll put pictures of these two organized organizations. One is the monarchists, who believe that the Iranian monarchy was deposed in 1979, deserves to come back and be given a second chance. So their leader, their chosen Shah to be, is based in Los Angeles. So they're really active and vocal there. And the other opposition is the Mujahideen, who's represented by Maryam Rajavi. You see there, Maryam Rajavi is meeting Giuliani. You will recall he was a close ally of Donald Trump and mayor of New York. So the Mujahideen movement, Mujahideen organization, has some strong connection with the US establishment. Their voices is taken seriously in the US establishment. I wouldn't be surprised if the US would think about the future of Iran and regime change involving Mujahideen in some capacity. But my reading of the situation is that these groups don't really have much influence within the country. The Iranian population, although they have a vision for freedom, and they have a vision for an end to the Islamic Republic of Iran, they have a vision for regime change, bottom-up regime change, they don't really have much love for the diaspora organizations. That is the problem in many ways. There is no internal organization of dissent and opposition to represent the revolution. There is no organization outside the country in the diaspora to represent the revolution. So it becomes a very disorganized movement of people with so much energy, so much heart. I have to move because the light goes off. Apologies. but really very little prospect of success, in my view, unfortunately. So what does the future hold? I have been burnt in the past by making predictions, so I'm not going to bring out my crystal ball out to give you a prediction of what's going to happen next, but I cannot see it ending well. That's all I can say about the future of protests in Iran. And before I finish, let me just spruik my recently published book that's available on Routledge website, the second edition of Middle East Politics and International Relations. So thank you very much. Stop sharing now. You're on mute, James. No? No, I cannot hear you, James.
How about now?
Okay, now good.
Is that better?
Yes, good, good.
Yeah. I do apologize for that. I'm unsure what's wrong with my headphones. Thank you immensely for that, Sharam. That was rather all-encompassing and very detailed in its in formulating kind of an overall picture for our audience and our members. I will now call for questions from the audience, should you have any, and I might actually read you one that's in the chat now and relate it to a larger question I had, which is, can you comment on the effect that Western sanctions are having on the Iranian economy, and more broadly than that, has this potential counter-revolution been spurred on by economic change? Has it been spurred on by increasing disparities of wealth?
Of course. Thanks for the question, James. Of course, sanctions have been very severe for the Iranian economy. The Iranian economy has been on a decline for the past few years. It enjoyed a modest rise following the signing of the nuclear deal, but then when President Trump withdrew and imposed secondary sanctions on any other state, any other country or company that had dealings with Iran, people basically have walked away from dealing with Iran. As a result, the Iranian economy has been in decline. And that means that prices keep going up. There is amazing inflation in Iran, and people have to have more than 2 jobs just to make ends meet. And I had a visitor coming recently, and he was saying that you cannot believe how much buying egg or chicken or rice costs. It's just unimaginable. So yes, there has been economic strife. And in the past, as I mentioned, there have been riots, bread riots, due to price hikes. But this is not about price hikes. What's happening right now is not about economic strife. What's happening right now is about political freedom. Now, this slogan is very clear: women, life, freedom. People are fed up and just tired of the extensive level of suppression and control that the regime is imposing on every aspect of their life, on every aspect. It's not just about the price of chicken. Obviously, it will help if chicken prices came down, but this is not the issue. So it's a more fundamental issue at stake. The problem with imposing sanctions, since we're talking about sanctions, sanctions tend to be a very blunt force, and the regime can always find ways of navigating and going around the sanctions regime, finding ways of continue to do business. But it's not possible for people to have the same level of resources to go around sanctions. So people end up paying for sanctions, but the regime continues to manage not flourish, but manage.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Kind of relating to that as well. You talked about sort of the about the seminaries, about the seminary schools at the moment, and the seeming indication that there might be different readings of religious texts currently going on amongst students, which is that's a fascinating development. Does that illustrate that there's a sense of need for reform amongst within the seminaries? Do they understand that these changes or this pushback does actually require some fundamental change?
Absolutely. This is not a new phenomenon. These voices, these dissenting voices, have been present within the Islamic establishment, within the seminaries. Perhaps they were more hush-hush and quiet in the past, but the recent developments, the mass protests, the mass rallies, have really perhaps given heart to those seminary students to also add their voice and raise their voice and raise their alternative interpretation of Islam and how the Islamic regime should behave. So they're adding their voice. But the need for a different interpretation of Islam in Iran has been present, and I think it's gathering momentum.
The gathering of momentum is a really interesting one, because as you say, there's no kind of directed pointed force at the moment for that change. There's a lot of change that wants to occur in lots of different directions.
Yeah.
Is there the prospect that these seminary schools could become that point for real change in Iran?
No. In fact, we have a publication. If you look up seminaries as bastions of resistance, the publication on that very point, that how seminaries are challenging the ideology of the Republic, Islamic Republic in Iran. The Iranian population, and that's the dichotomy, that's the oddity of the regime and the experience in Iran. The Iranian population has been going towards secularity and secularism. They have been questioning the role of religion in society as a whole. They don't want to have a moderate Islam. They want to have no Islam in public life. They want, maybe they are religious in their private affairs, but they want to keep it there. They don't want Islam to be in the public domain. They don't want Islam to dominate politics and social life and communal life. So there is a big divide between the population, especially the young people who are going in one direction, and the regime that keeps harping on and trying to enforce their idea that Islam and their understanding of Islam, their understanding should control and govern the state.
Yes, I could ask so many more questions about that, but in fairness to our audience, I should start to actually draw upon a couple of other areas. I'm going to link in a few questions here. Firstly, what would the effects be or what might the effects be on the wider Middle East of significant change in Iran? And obviously, this is being viewed very carefully by other religious and royal ruling families across the Middle East. Yes. And is there any evidence of their assistance in these or in this attempted counter-revolution? Are there any? Is there any evidence of funding or of support?
The impact of this revolution, if we get to a point where there is a change in the regime, if we get to a point where the current establishment is pushed out and there's a change of regime, not just a change of government, we're not talking about President Raisi stepping down and President Rouhani coming back on, not talking about that kind of cosmetic change. I'm talking about fundamental change. If there is a fundamental change in the way Iran is governed and Islam is pushed from the public domain into private affairs, so you have more or less a secular state, you can assume that there would be a rapprochement between Iran and its neighbors, rapprochement between Iran and the United States. It would mean Iran stopping its interference in the region, supporting Hezbollah, supporting Hamas, supporting other groups. So that proxy relationship will stop. And that's going to be huge. The implications for the region are just enormous. And that's going to allow Iran to be a more constructive team player in the region that works towards the stability, regional stability, and the betterment of life for people in the region through trade, through relations, you name it.
That's really interesting as well, because so that suggests that there's a sense that at least partly young people understand the impact that they can have in the region, in Iran. They understand. Absolutely.
People in Iran, this is before the protests happened a couple of years ago. There was an announcement that Iran was sending a loan, issuing money and sending funds to Hamas and Hezbollah. So students at Tehran University organized a rally in their amphitheater and started chanting, "Why do you send money to Hezbollah? We need the funds here. Why do you send money to Hamas? We need the funds here. Look after your own population. Don't worry about, stuff like that." So there is a disconnect. Again, I'm emphasizing there is a disconnect between the population and their idea of what should happen in the country and what the leadership sees. Second part of your question, I didn't respond to that, about tangible aid by neighboring countries to the population. I don't know. Who knows? I don't know if they are able to even provide support. But we know that the international media is covering the protests. Some complain that it's not covering it enough. Some saying it's doing the right job, the right thing. I don't know how much support there could be, but I wouldn't expect that to be significant, and I wouldn't expect that to really change anything of consequence.
Yeah, and I guess as well, as there's no direct force, there's no singular figure to rally around at the moment. There's very little figure through which aid could be delivered. Thinking broadly, you talk there about the disconnect between the ruling powers that be and the population. Is there any indication about if women were given the opportunity to remove their hijabs, what percentage of the Iranian population would do so?
That's an impossible question to answer, James. I don't know. Some would, some wouldn't.
But it's more.
The point is that it's a personal choice. It's a matter of personal choice. Those who can remove it and wish to remove it, okay. Those who can remove but wish to retain it, they retain it.
And thinking about that tension as well, the Kurdish the Kurdish population in Iran, are they mainly Sunni and then have tension with majority Shia rule?
Yes. So there is, on top of the ethnic factor, so we've talked about the gender factor, we've talked about the ethnic factor, then you also have the sectarian factor. The population in the periphery of Iran, in Sistan, in Kurdistan, and also in the south, are predominantly Sunni, which is different from the official Shia religion of Iran. So it does add another layer of complication. And they do feel marginalized. They do feel left out of the state. Officially, they can have representation in parliament. Officially, they can have their mosque, but unofficially, and everyone sees in everyday life, the real life experience is that they are suppressed.
In your presentation, one of the in the diagram that showed the rather complex structure of Iranian rule, you noted along the bottom line that there was a tab that described city councils that was almost seemed separate, and I was wondering whether you could comment upon city councils and the role that they have in governing Iran.
Yes, city councils are also directly elected. They don't feed into the central state structure. They manage city affairs. So in a way, they are the most democratic aspect of Iranian politics, but their purview is quite limited to city affairs, city park planning, traffic management, rubbish collection.
Is there a sense, because is there a sense that might be a structure that could support radical change? Is there a sense that whilst they are the most democratic aspect of Iranian rule, they could harbor, as in other revolutions, they could harbor a true counter-revolution? Or is there just not the, yeah?
Absolutely. I think the idea of having a republic is not dead in Iran. The idea of republic is very much alive. The idea that is being challenged is to have an Islamic republic, because you have this dichotomy. Who's in charge? Is it the people, the republic, or is it someone who says they represent God and speak for God? So you have the sovereignty of God versus sovereignty of people. You have that tension in the Islamic Republic of Iran. So people are challenging sovereignty of God, if you like, so to speak. They're challenging the Wali Faqih. They're saying he's a dictator. He doesn't answer to us. He just rules over us, and he has his own mechanism of rule and his mechanism of separation. So they're challenging him. They're rejecting him. But the idea that people should have a voice, should have a republic, that idea is very much alive. And city councils could, of course, serve that purpose. But we do have the parliament. You know, we have the elected body, the elected structure of a republic is in place. It's so that it's overladen with those appointed institutions. If you remove those, the parliament can become the voice of the people.
The prospect of that, are there voices? You noted that previous influential figures in Iranian politics have remained quite quiet at the moment, seemingly out of self-preservation. Fair enough too. Are there dissenting voices within Iranian parliament, within the Iranian parliament?
Not within the parliament, no. So within the establishment, as you mentioned, they try to speak with one voice, and that's a hardline message that they try to send. The head of the Revolutionary Guards issued an ultimatum recently to protesters, saying that street protests need to end. You've had your fun, you've been in the streets, but now it's time to stop, and Revolutionary Guards will step in if you have to. And only recently, 2 days ago, members of parliament issued a statement saying they are calling for maximum penalty, maximum punishment for protesters who are disrupting the country. So there is no voices of dissent within the establishment, but there are voices of dissent very much everywhere else.
Well, and that's a rather fascinating way to end that part of the conversation. Now, I've had a couple of comments asking about Russia.
Yes.
And I mean, we've all seen the pictures of Iranian drones that have been used in Russia's conflict with Ukraine. How might those uprisings affect the Russian-Iranian relationship, and are there any kind of deeper links here?
Well, the Iranian regime has thrown all its eggs in one basket, and that's Russia's basket. I think they have just given up on the idea of having a nuclear deal with the US and European partners. They have been explicitly supporting Putin, supporting Putin's policies and the war in Ukraine. Of course, the drones is just the tip of the iceberg in a way. The irony is that they expecting that Russia would come to their rescue and come to their aid if things get out of hand. Russia has its own agenda. Russia has its own policies and priorities. Russia is not going to sacrifice its own interests if there is a way out for Russia for the sake of Iran. So that's a miscalculation, huge miscalculation on the side of the Iranian regime. The Iranian public is obviously, they don't feel the same way towards Russia. They don't feel that Russia is a reliable partner. The Iranian public is very pro-American. That again, that's one of the ironies of the situation. The public, especially the young, they just want to have normal relations with the world, with the West. They want to travel. They want to have access to goods. So there's again another disconnect between the population and the regime.
The last question that we've got in the chat, which might be where we end, is kind of I want to pose this as a two-pronged question. How was Iran affected by COVID-19, and has there been any fundamental societal change based upon COVID-19 that's at least partly precipitated this set of revolutionary actions?
Iran was affected really badly by COVID-19. In fact, for a time, Iran became the source, the hub of infection for the region, which really deteriorated relations between Iran and its neighbors, who blamed Iran for not managing the infections. There have been many infections in Iran. The Iranian health system was not coping. There have been many deaths. And that has been another example, another case of mismanagement and Iranian state's inability to respond to a crisis, a health crisis. So again, disillusioning the population about how the regime can serve, or in fact cannot serve, its population. Whether there have been lessons learned, whether there has been any changes, not that I know of. I don't think anything has changed in that space. That might be another question, another topic to explore in a future discussion.
Well, on that note, Professor, we have unfortunately run out of time. I feel like these conversations could always last 2 or 3 hours, if I'm perfectly honest. There is just so much. There is so much to get through when we discuss Iran, and there are so many fundamentally competing viewpoints, fundamentally competing actions. And so we thank you immensely, as always, for shedding some light on them. Thank you for joining us all this evening. Professor Shahram Akbarsadeh, thank you very much. And we will see you all very soon.
Thank you very much for having me. Have a